Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you're watching this, welcome, welcome. We're back for another week of reading The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life by Solomon, Greenberg, and Pyszczynski. And I hope you're all doing well. Thank you, Jeffrey, for joining me in here today. We have somebody back to talk to and read to. If you are looking at the YouTube feed on the chat, you'll see some of the kind of the overview here. I'll put it up on the screen. Hey, welcome, Boguslav. Good to see you. Welcome. Let me do that first. I'm going to put this up here real quick. So what we've learned and will learn. So this gets really interesting here in chapter 7. This is called The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. Sorry. And this is where my project really takes off. This is where, so up to this point, we've talked about the historical concepts and, ancient peoples putting up, religious things to ward off death versus, societies and, kind of through that whole hunter-gatherer thing on its head and things like that, or at least propose that, whether that's true or not, we don't know, but it's an interesting proposition. But, so far we've talked about William James, the book. He's a, kind of the 19th century first kind of psychologist, if you will, or psychiatrist or philosopher, dubbed the knowledge that we must die is the worm at the core, right? That whole parable of eating the apple, the tree of knowledge, and then the knowledge being that we're going to die. And the human condition. And then in 1974, the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, whom I really look toward for all this, won Pulitzer Prize for the denial of death. He's arguing that the terror of death has a pervasive effect on human affairs. And that's what we're reading about in The Worm at the Core, are these three contemporary experimental social psychologists are building a framework of evidence, empirical evidence around these theories. So Solomon, Greenberg, Pyszczynski, their wide-ranging evidence. In many ways, the worm at the core guides our thoughts and actions, from the great art we create to the devastating wars we wage. So all of these things are really coming together as we look at this book. The authors are showing us how our unconscious fear of death powers almost everything we do, shining a light on the hidden motives that drive human behavior. That's what's most fascinating to me, is that people don't really pay attention to any of this. We live our lives in these cocoons or these insulated bubbles, if you will, and we don't address what drives our behavior. We think we know, right? We think we have a good idea, but we really don't. These theories show conclusively that our fear of death and the desire to transcend it, big parts on immortality, right? Literal and symbolic. Desire to transcend us, inspire us to buy expensive cars, crave fame, put our health at risk, and disguise our animal nature. And I know we haven't talked about animality yet. That's the next chapter, chapter 8. This book really gets taking off for me in these next few chapters. The fear of death can also prompt judges to dole out harsher punishments, if we've seen those kinds of things in the Phoenix or Tucson area in Arizona. Judges presented with remembering or thinking about their death, not thinking about their death, and how they were more punitive when they thought about their death, holding up their cultural worldview, their law and order worldview, to really put it down on these prostitutes. Make children react negatively to people different from themselves, right? We've seen a lot of studies so far about usually foreign children and Americans as well too, but foreign children doing those kinds of things, and inflame intolerance and violence. And then finally, terror management theory proposes that human culture, our cultural worldviews, infuses our lives with order, stability, significance, and purpose. And these anchors enable us to function moment to moment, meaning, and not becoming overwhelmed with knowledge of our ultimate faith, meaning that we cling to our cultural worldviews to buffer that death anxiety. And this is happening when we don't even know it. We're not even, most psychological activity goes on way unconscious. we're not even cognizant of what's happening when we're doing things. But when we sit down and we start thinking about these ideas and these things, we start to see, oh yeah, I don't feel so great about that. I feel good about this, those kinds of things. Hey, good morning, Fred. Greetings. Good to see you in here. And Linda too. Hey, we got Linda in here. Hello, hello. So that's kind of where we're at so far. Let's jump over. I'm going to just share my screen here and talk just a little bit about what we're going to read today. This gets really good. This is where it gets exciting for me. I mean, I like the whole book, don't get me wrong, but this is where it really takes off for me. So like I said, this is chapter 7, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. And boy, that is an appropriate title for this chapter. This is really going to get into the nitty gritty and the meat of it. Derogation and Dehumanization, Cultural Assimilation and Accommodation, Demonization and Destruction, September 11, 2001, The Lash and the Backlash, Dr. Strangelove in the Lab, Nothing New Under the Sun, and Out on a Limb. That's what we're going to look at today. That's the chapter and the sub-chapters there. And then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about, I'm going to read you a couple of things from a couple of quotes that I think are really applicable. So let's jump right into this. Open the book up here, and here we go. Chapter 7, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. Perhaps the whole root of our trouble, the human trouble, is that we will sacrifice all the beauty of our lives, will imprison ourselves in totems, taboos, crosses, blood sacrifices, steeples, mosques, races, armies, flags, nations, in order to deny the fact of death. That is a wonderful quote. James Baldwin, I love his writing. Absolutely powerful. It's from The Fire Next Time. According to terror management theory, the combination of a basic biological inclination towards self-preservation with sophisticated cognitive capacities render us humans aware of our perpetual vulnerabilities and inevitable mortality, which gives rise to potentially paralyzing terror. Cultural worldviews and self-esteem help manage this terror by convincing us that we are special beings with souls and identities that will persist, literally and or symbolically, long past our own physical death. We are thus pervasively preoccupied with maintaining confidence in our cultural scheme of things and satisfying the standards of values associated with it. But preserving faith in our cultural worldviews and self-esteem becomes challenging when we encounter others with different beliefs. Sinister complications almost inevitably ensue. This is where my project gets legs and starts to take off. So this is what I've been preoccupied with, these ideas and these explanations of these theories from here on out. When Dutch and English settlers arrived in the lower Hudson Valley, that's in the state of New York, in the 17th century, they marveled at the sheer beauty and the prodigious natural bounties of the New World. They were also intrigued by the natives, the Lenape's, that means the people, who had inhabited the land for thousands of years, were happy, peaceful, welcoming, and eager to trade furs for blankets and tools. Moreover, according to first-hand accounts by the Dutch settlers, the Lenape's were well-fashioned people, strong and sound of body, well-fed, without blemish. Some have lived 100 years. Also, there are among them no simpletons, lunatics, or madmen, as among us. I thought that was interesting. At the same time, the Europeans found the Lenape's very unsettling. They lived in communal log houses, big enough for a dozen families. They relocated seasonally. They traced their kinship through their mothers, and women had considerable power in communal affairs. They divided themselves into clans identified by animals such as wolves, turtles, or turkeys. They refrained from hunting excessively because their religion stressed that all life was interrelated and interdependent. That's a very powerful thought right there. And this is where we disconnect from nature and eventually from other human beings. I think that's a big problem in our world today. Eventually, the settlers felt that something had to be done to dispose of these most barbarous, wilderness savages. So the Dutch and English proceeded to exterminate the Lenapes and other Native American tribes. They had a good time doing it too. In 1644, the director of New Netherland, Wilhelm Kieft, laughed right heartily at the soldiers tortured and butchered Lenapes in their villages. The soldiers took one captive, threw him down, and stuck his private parts, which they had cut off, into his mouth while he was still alive, and after that placed him on a millstone and beat his head off, while Dutch women amused themselves by kicking the victims' heads around like soccer balls. While it might be tempting to view the European slaughter of the Lenapes as aberration, it's in full accord with a long record of human barbarism. History has been marked by an ongoing succession of genocidal atrocities, ethnic cleansings, and brutal subjugation of domestic inferiors. Assyrian bas-reliefs from 1100 BC depict the populace of captured cities impaled alive on stakes running through their groin and out their shoulders. Assyrian kings boasted of their conquest and tried to outdo one another's brutality. Ashurbanipal, who reigned from 668 to 627 BC, proudly described his treatment of one captive king. I took him alive in the midst of the battle. In my capital, I slowly tore off his skin. Attila the Hun, Caligula, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Cruel, Rasputin, Robespierre, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Francois Duvalier, Idi Amin, Nicole Ceausescu, Pol Pot, Saddam Hussein, the list goes on. But demonic despots are never singularly responsible for the virulent hatred and genocidal atrocities. It takes normal people, those who see themselves as doing God's work, their patriotic duty, or just following orders, to stoke the gas chambers at Auschwitz, to sow the killing fields in Cambodia. More recently, United Nations peacekeeping forces have had their hands full in more than a dozen countries around the world. In Gaza and throughout Europe, the Hamas satellite station Al Aqwas broadcasts a children's show in which Farfar, a Mickey Mouse clone, teaches Muslim children to hate Jews. It's working quite well. 3-year-old Shamia called the show to joyfully tell the host, "We don't like Jews because they are dogs. We will fight them." In Israel, Arabs to the crematoria and Arab subhuman are among the slogans spray painted by Jewish graffiti artists in Jerusalem. In America, youngsters in Fred Phelps Westboro Baptist Church carry signs at rallies proclaiming God's hatred of Catholics, Muslims, fags, Jews, and N-words, and disrupt funerals of American soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan with chants that God killed them to punish the nation for its modestly tolerant treatment of homosexuals. Such inflammatory rhetoric is accompanied by increasingly destructive weapons and tactics meant to maximize physical harm. Machine guns, shoulder-fired rocket launchers, napalm showers, fertilizer bombs, improvised explosive devices, and psychological harm. Anthrax-laced letters, suicide bombings, grisly beheadings posted on the internet. And today's nuclear weapons make Little Boy and Fat Man, the atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, seem like firecrackers by comparison. Human hatred and violence are, in part, a residual hangover from our tribal primate heritage. Chimps are aggressive in defending and expanding their territory, and they occasionally murder other chimps that do not belong to their group. Early human hunter-gatherers evidently fought wars over 10,000 years ago for the same reasons, to preserve and enhance their regional influence in pursuit of resources such as food, water, and mates. Only humans, however, hate and kill other humans with righteous exuberance for symbolic affronts, worshiping different gods, saluting different flags, or humiliation hundreds or thousands of years in the past. And in the increasing mastery of technology of death does not inspire confidence in the future of our species. And then I say, this is what my work is based on. This is a paragraph that really brings home what I'm trying to do with this work. This is the inspiration for what I'm doing now. This entire section describes the cycle of othering and the origins of evil. This is by Alan Harrington, the Immortalist, from the Immortalist. If those weird individuals with beards and funny hats are acceptable, then what about my claim to superiority? Does he, that one, dare to hope to live forever too, and perhaps crowd me out? I don't like it. All I know is if he's right, I'm wrong. So different and funny looking. I think he's trying to fool the gods with his sly ways. Let's show him up. He's not very strong. For a start, see what he'll do if I poke him. Our longing transcends death. Our longing to transcend death inflames violence toward each other. While our cultural scheme of things keeps a lid on our mortal dread, others cling to very different sets of belief to manage theirs. Acknowledging their truths inevitably calls ours into question. We have to believe in our own truths to sustain the precarious view that life is meaningful and that we are significant, enduring beings. One culture is always a potential menace to another, Becker observed, because it is a living example that life can go on heroically within a value framework totally alien to one's own. If the Aborigines' belief that magical ancestors metamorphosed into humans after becoming lizards is credible, then the idea that God created the world in 6 days and Adam in his image must be suspect. And that the threat posed by different belief systems runs much deeper than mutual exclusive creation stories. Our entire way of life, everything we believe in, and everything we strive for can be challenged by alternative worldviews. For example, in his 2002 song, Outside of the Inside, the Muslim singer, songwriter, guitarist Richard Thompson tried to convey, in part to express his opposition to the Taliban's fundamentalist view of the world. The song referred to Einstein, Newton, and Shakespeare as childish, senseless, and corrupt, and Van Gogh and Botticelli as offensive madmen scraping colors on a board. Hearing the song for the first time, we were dumbfounded and outraged. I encourage you to look that song up and listen to it and read the lyrics. It's amazing. It's powerful. It's good too. It's a good. I'd never heard of the guy before. It's quite amazing. You can go on YouTube and just search that and listen to that song and read the lyrics. Einstein and Newton, surely among the greatest scientists in the history of Earth, pointless and senseless. We grew up wanting to be like them. Shakespeare, small-minded and childish. We think he's the greatest writer of all time. Painting is blaspheming madness? That's shocking nonsense. It is deeply disturbing to have one's fundamental beliefs called into question. Take our meanings and purposes away, characterize them as juvenile, useless, or evil, and all we have left are the vulnerable physical creatures that we are. Because cultural conceptions of reality keep a lid on mortal dread, acknowledging the legitimacy of beliefs contrary to our own unleashes the very terror those beliefs serve to quell. So we must parry the threat by derogating and dehumanizing those with alternative views of life by forcing them to adopt our beliefs and co-opting aspects of their cultures into our own, or by obliterating them entirely. Moreover, people's sense of meaning and significance cannot completely alleviate mortal terror. Symbols are extremely powerful. Indeed, they are the underlying basis of human imagination, creativity, and the uniquely human capacity to transform reality in accordance with our desires. But no symbol is sufficiently commanding to completely overcome the terror of death. There is always residual death anxiety, a rumble of panic that is projected onto other groups of people designated as all-encompassing repositories of evil. And when those in one group bolster their psychological security by imposing their will and venting their animosity on another, this frequently produces a backlash by the others, resulting in a vicious cycle of bitter acrimony. Derogation and dehumanization. Our first line of psychological defense against those whose conceptions of reality are different from our own is to derogate or belittle them, diminish the threat, their beliefs pose to our own. They are ignorant savages like the Lunapes, or servants of the devil, or they are brainwashed by evil masters. Perhaps they are not even human. The Nazis portrayed Jews as rats. In the Inuit Mubuti or Orokawe and Yanomamo and the Kalili cultures, the word for their own groups mean man or human, implying, of course, that members of other groups are not human. Traditional Arabs from the Nejd in Saudi Arabia are blunter. They refer to all outsiders as Tarish al-Bar, vomit from the sea. Americans are no less prone to such dehumanization. For example, during the First Persian Gulf War, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who I personally, when I was in the military, he was my commander. He inspected me a couple of times. General Norman Schwarzkopf declared that Iraqis, quote, weren't members of the same human race as the rest of us. And flyers circulated among the troops likening Iraqis to ants and cockroaches. Meanwhile, back stateside, Americans put bumper stickers on their cars declaring, I don't break for Iraqis. This tendency to belittle others is particularly pronounced in the wake of death reminders. Studies have demonstrated that after pondering their mortality, Christians denigrate Jews, conservatives condemn liberals, Italians despise Germans, and Israeli children dislike Russian kids, and people everywhere ridicule immigrants. And death reminders cause us to see members of such outgroups as less human and more animalistic. Sadly, these tactics work. It's easier to dispose of troublesome thoughts of death when one disparages different others. Cultural assimilation and accommodation. Besides denigrating those who are different, we can show these ignorant, misguided, or sinful people the light, thereby assimilating them into our worldview. What better proof of the validity of our worldview than for others to come around to our way of thinking? For example, David Bogue, a Scotsman born in 1750, was famous for his evangelical zeal. Known as the father of the London Missionary Society, Bogue exhorted the faithful to head to points afar to divest the heathens of their misguided beliefs. We are commanded to love our neighbors as ourselves, and Christ has taught us that every man is our neighbor. Ye were once pagans, living in cruel and abominable idolatry. The servants of Jesus came from other lands and preached his gospel among you. Hence your knowledge of salvation. And ought ye not, as equitable compensation for their kindness, to send messengers to the nations which are in like condition with yourselves of old, to entreat them that turn from their dumb idols to serve the living God, and to wait for his son from heaven? Buddhist missionaries spread their doctrine centuries before Jesus' birth. Islamic missionaries followed Allah's command to engage the dua, to summon, call unto the way of thy Lord with wisdom and fair exhortation, and reason with them in the better way. Mormon missionaries do the same around the world today. And such proselytizers have plenty of company in the secular realm. Devout atheists hold seminars and distribute pamphlets to rid the world of religion. Rush Limbaugh's ditto heads exhort Americans to escape the thrall of what they see as creeping American socialism. Vegetarian zealots show school children films of slaughterhouses to encourage them to adopt their tofu-based dietary preferences. Why? The answer is simple. Cultural worldviews gain strength in numbers. For beliefs to serve as effective bulwarks against existential terror, people must be absolutely certain of their validity. However, most of the core beliefs we depend on for psychological security are based on faith rather than fact. They cannot be unambiguously proven. Consequently, the more people who share our beliefs, the more sure we feel that they are correct. If just one person believed that God spoke to Moses in the form of a burning bush, antipsychotic medication would be sought to relieve this poor soul of his florid delusion. But when the same belief is shared by millions of people, it becomes unassailable truth. Since our sense of being more than mortal animals is dependent on these unassailable truths, our desire to have them validated is especially strong when death is close to mind. Reminders of death make Christians more intent on persuading atheists to embrace Jesus, and make evolutionists more determined to persuade creationists to embrace Darwin. Furthermore, studies show that proselytizing is prophylactic. If I learn that you have adopted my beliefs, I feel more confident of their validity, and consequently, don't worry so much about my own death. In addition to trying to convince others to adopt our own customs and beliefs, we humans also tend to tame the views we find threatening by incorporating attractive aspects of them into our own cultural worldview. We refer to this as cultural accommodation because people are altering their own worldview to include something appealing from another worldview, but in a manner that does not undermine their most cherished beliefs and values. Consider the countercultural movement in the United States in the 1960s, when young people began to tune in, turn on, and drop out. Sparked by the support for the civil rights movement and opposition to the escalating war in Vietnam, the hippies railed against the military-industrial complex and the greed, materialism, sexism, racism, and sexual repression that went with it. There was a call to be more respectful of other cultures, minorities, women, and the environment, and to move toward a simpler and more peaceful lifestyle. Young people also rejected the clean-cut Ozzie and Harriet look of their parents and older siblings. They donned blue jeans to show their sympathy for Woody Guthrie's Working Man. They turned away from meat and started eating granola and other natural health foods. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll were the cultural linchpins of their lives. At the same time, these affectations were viewed as a serious threat to traditional American values, earning the scorn of upstanding citizens everywhere. Quote, "A hippie is someone who looks like Tarzan, walks like Jane, and smells like cheetah," quipped the then California Governor Ronald Reagan. Yet by the time Reagan became president, the hippies' peace and love values had morphed into an insipid Coke commercial. "I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. I'd like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company." After commercialism crashed into Woodstock, designer blue jeans sold for $100. Grocery stores sold chocolate-covered granola bars with 50 ingredients, and elevator music versions of the classic 60s protest songs gently rocked dentist office waiting rooms. One could then enjoy the appealing looks, tastes, and sounds without being disturbed by those worldview-threatening messages about a simpler, less status-conscious, healthier, and more peaceful lifestyle. Our fear of people who differ from us, is also quelled by putting them into neat little boxes where they can serve the stereotypical cultural roles members of certain groups are expected to inhabit. The athletic rapping black man, the amenable family-oriented Mexican, the brainy studious Asian, the angry jihadist Arab, the effete northeastern intellectual clinging to his Marx and Pinot Grigio, the redneck southerner clinging to his guns and Bible. In fact, when death is close to mind, people prefer their outgroups to fit simple stereotypes. Following a death reminder, Americans prefer Germans to be neat and organized, male homosexuals to be effeminate, men to pay for dinner, and women to babysit the neighbor's kids. To the extent that such stereotypes are part of the cultural scheme of things, outgroup members who confirm them validate the worldview, while outgroup members who violate them threaten it. Accordingly, when the need for faith in one's worldview is high, people may actually prefer outgroup members who are radically different from the in-group over those who are closer to the cultural mainstream. This could account for the popularity of and affection for fictional figures such as Amos and Andy, Jack Benny's sidekick, Rochester, and actors such as Stephen Fetchit among the white Americans in the 20th century. It could also explain why racists who fear and dislike African Americans nonetheless venerate well-known Black athletes, musicians, and entertainers. In one experiment, reminders of death led white American college students to prefer an African American gangster to a straight-laced Black person. White American college students met Michael, an African American male posing as a fellow participant for a study. Michael dressed and behaved in a way that either confirmed or violated the cultural stereotype of African American males. In the stereotype confirmation condition, he wore long, baggy, short pants and a backwards Atlanta Braves baseball cap. In the stereotype violation condition, he was dressed in khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and a sports coat. Escorted into a supposed getting acquainted study, the real participants were reminded of their own death or a neutral topic, and then exchanged essays with Michael about what they had done over the summer. When Michael was dressed in his gangster costume, he wrote about hanging with his homies, drinking 40s, and doing serious clubbing and cruising for honeys. But when Michael showed up looking like a serious job interviewee, he wrote in formal English about taking computer science classes for his business degree and reading classic novels and playing chess. The participants then evaluated Michael. In the control condition, the white students strongly preferred the studious stereotype violator to the clubbing and cruising Michael. However, those who had been reminded of their death far preferred the gangster Michael to the button-down African American. When existential terror is aroused, we fortify our cultural scheme of things by encouraging others to conform to socially sanctioned cookie cutter molds. Fascinating. Demonization and destruction. When derogation, assimilation, and accommodation are insufficient to secure a sense of equanimity, psychological push often comes to physical shove. Might becomes right in the service of eliminating the threatening other entirely, in part because our symbolic solutions to death are never psychologically sufficient. Cultural worldviews are embodied in powerful beliefs, symbols, and icons like flags and crucifixes. However, death is a very real physical problem, and there is always lingering death anxiety that humans project onto other groups of people whom they designate as evil that must be destroyed. People in the ancient world often used animals as tangible locus for their death anxiety. For example, on the ancient Hebrew Day of Atonement, 2 goats were chosen by Lot. A Lord's goat was offered as the blood sacrifice for the sins of Israel, and the second, I can't say Azazel, I think, or scapegoat, was cast out into the wilderness bearing the sins of God's people. In ancient Greece, the scapegoat was not an animal, but a person. When a community was in the grip of an infectious disease or famine, the pharmakos, or human scapegoat, was the object of the village's scorn. The pharmakos was usually a person regarded as lowly, a criminal, a slave, or a cripple who was either beaten or stoned and then ejected from the city. Throughout history, individuals and entire groups have served as psychological lightning rods for death anxiety. Often, the evildoers are unambiguously worthy of such deception. Attila the Hun and Adolf Hitler make just about everyone's list of the top 10 most evil people in history. Sometimes, however, evil is in the eye of the proverbial beholder. Barack Obama and Walmart are each vilified by their detractors while glorified by their supporters. Even superficially benign groups like vegetarians, country music enthusiasts, and New York Yankees fans can serve as objects of evil incarnate for some. Famines, plagues, economic upheaval, political instability, educational deficiencies, power outages, illiteracy, youthful insubordination, you name it. It's their fault. We are good and pure and right and made in God's image with his countenance shining upon us. They are the problem, and the solution is clear. Derogate, dehumanize, demonize, destroy. Eradicate the evildoers. Purify the world. Prove that God is on your side. Make life on earth as it is in heaven. The disquieting point here is that because people need some tangible and potentially controllable cause of their residual death anxiety, they will identify or create different others to serve this purpose. If we could only get rid of those fill in the blank, terrorists, infidels, socialists, globalists, homosexuals, liberals, Tea Party Republicans, Jews, Muslims, illegal immigrants, or what have you, then all of our problems would be solved. Although finding evil others provides a focus for disposing of residual death anxiety, this strategy usually backfires by increasing the actual threat posed by the others. Attempts to eradicate the evil other fan the flames of conflict by arousing death fears in those on the receiving end, not only through direct threats to their physical existence, but also by the psychological humiliation of being belittled and dehumanized. How can people maintain their sense of being significant contributors to a meaningful world while having their homeland appropriated and being forced to relinquish traditional beliefs and adopt an alien way of life? Or while witnessing treasured traditions and artifacts absorbed into the dominant culture in demeaning ways? Or while serving as a cultural caricature? Or while being treated as animals, like the naked and tortured prisoners at Abu Ghraib? Humiliation strips people of their self-esteem and reduces them to vulnerable creatures rather than significant beings in a world of meaning. According to a Somali proverb, humiliation is worse than death. In times of war, words of humiliation hurt more than bullets. Bullets slay your body. Humiliation slaughters the sense of death transcending significance that shields you from the terror of being just an ephemeral creature. And history is replete with wars of vengeance fought to repair wounded pride. The Trojan War, depicted in the Iliad, began after Menelaus, king of Sparta, was humiliated when his wife Helen was seduced by Paris, who took her away to the city of Troy. In response to this insult, Menelaus' troops besieged the city for the next 10 years, burning most of it to the ground, killing all the men, and raping or enslaving the women and children. There are no shortages of efforts to avenge and overcome humiliation and shame in modernity, generally with tragic consequences. In the 20th century, Hitler was elected by promising to wipe out the shame of Versailles. In World War II, Japanese kamikaze pilots sacrificed themselves to alleviate feelings of shame aroused by the prospect of defeat at the hands of their enemies. These martyrdom operations became more frequent as Japan's losses mounted toward the end of the war. A 1965 Defense Department memorandum stated that the United States' primary aim in the Vietnam War was, quote, to avoid a humiliating U.S. defeat. And in the 21st century, after interviewing Al-Qaeda supporters and right-wing American Christian militia members, sociologist Mark Juergensmeyer reported that, quote, almost everyone who was a supporter of or involved in religious violence said that they felt an enormous sense of frustration and humiliation. Although each of these examples varies considerably, occurring in dissimilar cultural contexts with different histories, they all involved intense feelings of humiliation that fueled egregious acts of violence. The humiliation that arouses lethal violence often stems from unresolved conflicts from the distant past that serve as rallying points for feelings of victimization and the need for heroic redemption. For example, the bloody conflicts in Kosovo and Bosnia in the 1990s were fueled in part by exhortations to avenge the Serbians' loss of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. Humiliated people attempt to restore their pride and dignity by berating and eradicating their oppressors. When a humiliated mind is left to reflect on its own destruction, writes Dr. Evelyn Linder, it may become convinced that it must inflict even greater pain on the perpetrator. So begins a vicious cycle of violation and vindication that both sides believe they are obligated to pursue. Neither side can break free because being the first to back down would be further humiliation. So they remain trapped in a self-perpetuating cycle of mayhem and murder. September 11th, 2001, the Lash and the Backlash. The September 11, 2001 Al-Qaeda attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center and ensuing events poignantly illustrate how death fears provoke reciprocal cycles of hatred and violence in pursuit of a heroic triumph over evil. In the 1980s, Osama bin Laden's goals were allegedly political. He wanted to dislodge Russian troops from Afghanistan and subsequently to evict American troops from Muhammad's holy land of Saudi Arabia. However, in 1998, bin Laden joined radical Islamic clerics declaring jihad against America, in part to avenge humiliating affronts to Islam dating back to the Crusades in the 11th century and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. The United States has been occupying the lands of Islam in the holiest places, the Arabian Peninsula, plundering its riches, dictating to its rulers, humiliating its people, terrorizing its neighbors, and turning its bases in the peninsula into a spearhead through which to fight the neighboring Muslim peoples. We call on every Muslim who wishes to be rewarded to comply with Allah's order to kill the Americans and plunder their money. We call on the Muslim ulema, leaders, youths, and soldiers to launch the raid on Satan's U.S. troops and the devil's supporters allying with them. Concrete political goals. The dispatching of foreign troops into Saudi Arabia has metastasized into humiliation-fueled divinely ordained duty to destroy Satan's emissaries. What better way to infuse a conflict with cosmic significance and attract adherents willing to sacrifice their lives than to declare a holy war against American evildoers? The events of 9/11 delivered a powerful 1-2 death threat punch to Americans. First, they witnessed potent images of death. Millions were horrified as the Twin Towers collapsed, staggered by the knowledge that the Pentagon was ablaze and another plane had crashed in Pennsylvania. Second, beyond the literal carnage, they were mortified as three of the foremost symbols of Americans' scheme of things had been endangered or assaulted. One symbol of the United States' financial and business prosperity, the Twin Towers, was wholly destroyed. Another symbol of its global military domination, the Pentagon, was badly damaged. The third target, presumably the White House or the Capitol, symbolized American democracy itself. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, Americans behaved with extraordinary compassion and efficiency. Police and firefighters streamed in from around the country. Blood banks and food banks overflowed. Doing's one part restored a sense of national pride. People responded to the existential threat with assertions of their own values as well as that of their homeland. But lingering death fears also intensified Americans' zeal to derogate, dehumanize, demonize, assimilate, and destroy. Christian evangelist Franklin Graham denounced Islam as a very evil and wicked religion. Lieutenant General William Boykin, the U.S. Department Undersecretary of Defense, portrayed the conflict with Islamic radicals as a fight against the devil. The enemy is a spiritual enemy. He called the principalities of darkness. He's called the principality of darkness. The enemy is a guy called Satan. Former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger said, "You have to kill some of these people. Even if they were not directly involved, they need to be hit." The nation's leaders also stepped in to fulfill Americans' need for heroic transcendence. On September 17, 2001, President George W. Bush declared, quote, "This is a new kind of evil, and we understand, and the American people are beginning to understand, this crusade is going to take a while. We'll rid the world of the evildoers," end quote. Vice President Dick Cheney added that nations that failed to join the crusade would face the full wrath of the United States. Prior to 9/11, Bush's presidency was viewed as ineffectual and uninspired, even to many of his Republican supporters. However, the president's approval ratings reached historical, unprecedented heights a few weeks thereafter. That Bush's tremendous popularity was in part a result of the dramatic and ongoing reminders of death and vulnerability provoked by the attacks was confirmed by experiments we conducted in 2002 and 2003, showing that following a reminder of death, Americans felt more supportive of President Bush and his policies in Iraq. Then, as a standing president, confidently purveying the classic charismatic message that we are divinely ordained to defeat the forces of evil, Bush served Americans' terror management needs far better than his opponent, Senator John Kerry. In the 2004 presidential election, in a control condition in which we reminded participants of intense pain, Americans rated Senator John Kerry more favorably than Bush. But after a reminder of death, Bush was more favorably evaluated than Kerry. 6 weeks before the election, control participants reported that they would be voting for Senator Kerry by a 4-1 margin, but other participants, after thinking about death, favored Bush almost a 3-1 margin. Bush's terror management value was likely enhanced by the military operations he initiated in Afghanistan in 2001 and in Iraq in 2003. Saddam Hussein was dispatched in short order. The Taliban took major early hits. These events paved the way for an influx of missionaries into both countries, where they felt it was their duty to disabuse the natives of their misguided religious and political convictions. Christian fundamentalists built churches and distributed Bibles along with anti-Islamic diatribes. Unperturbed by Muslims' vigorous objections, occasionally these missionaries met with violent resistance to their efforts, but they believed that their death would have been for a good cause. Our activities can lead to people dying, said Todd Nettleton, Director of Media Development for the evangelical group of Voice of the Martyrs. But the reality is an eternity with Christ in heaven is so far better than an eternity in hell. That is a good deal. Simultaneously, political and economic emissaries served the mission of the 2002 National Security Strategy to extend the benefits of freedom across the globe by designating democratic capitalism as the single sustainable model of national success. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11 attacks, most Muslims quickly denounced the attackers and as a lunatic fringe of religious zealots misrepresenting Islam. Shortly thereafter, however, Muslims were mortified and humiliated by Americans' blanket condemnation of Islam, religious and political proselytizing, and George W. Bush's declaration of a crusade to rid the world of evil, followed by the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. The shock and awe military attacks killed tens of thousands of innocent victims as collateral damage. The looting of Baghdad and the humiliations at the Abu Ghraib prison served as a powerful, symbolic, and literal reminders of death to Muslims everywhere, just as the 9/11 attacks had been to Americans. Lingering death fears intensified their zeal to derogate, dehumanize, demonize, assimilate, and destroy. As was the case in the United States, the Islamic merchants of humiliation took to the airwaves and the internet to spread fear and outrage against Americans. Polls told the chilling story of an increasing hostility toward the West. Almost a third of those polled in Turkey, half in Pakistan, and 3/4 in Morocco and Jordan said that suicide bombings against Israelis, Americans, and Europeans in Iraq were justified. Many Muslim children yearned to become martyrs, Shahid, at the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. An 8-year-old boy showed a reporter, quote, a portrait of his family had taken of him clutching an AK-47 and said that his older brother was a Shahid, a martyr. Then he hung his head and admitted that no, his brother is alive and never did anything so grand. At the Jenin camp in the West Bank, a 13-year-old girl said that although her father wanted her to become a doctor, she would prefer to study nuclear physics so she could blow up America. There was also a lot of lethal backlash. The Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl, a Jewish American, was kidnapped in Pakistan in January of 2002 and subsequently decapitated. The gruesome spectacle was taped and widely circulated throughout the world. In October 2002, a car bomb exploded outside a popular tourist nightclub in Bali, killing more than 200 civilians and wounding 100. On March 11, 2004, a series of coordinated bombings on commuter trains in Madrid, killing almost 200 people and wounding almost 2,000. On July 7, 2005, a similar attack on trains and a bus in London killed 52 people and 4 suicide bombers and injured 700. Meanwhile, Muslim missionaries funded by Saudi Arabia espousing the teachings of the Wahhabi sect became more active in Europe and Asia, seeking new converts to their fundamentalist version of Islam. Now, more than a decade after the 9/11 attacks, the lashes and backlashes continue as each side continues to disparage, dehumanize, demonize, humiliate, and destroy the other. Anti-American and anti-Israeli sentiments remain high in most Islamic countries. In 2010, the Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohammed Morsi, former president of Egypt, gave a speech imploring fellow Egyptians to nurse our children and our grandchildren on hatred. on hatred for Jews and Zionists. These bloodsuckers, these warmongers, the descendants of apes and pigs, they are hostile by nature. Morsi declared America and Europe as Zionist supporters. Thus, they were enemies too. Lethal violence continues in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, India, Mali, Somalia, and elsewhere. In America and Europe, homegrown hatred of and violence toward Islam persists. 1 in 3 Americans believe that Muslims should be barred from running for president. And a substantial minority of Americans still worry that President Barack Obama is a Muslim. Many Americans remain opposed to building mosques in their neighborhoods, and such opposition increases following reminders of death. Dr. Strangelove in the lab. George Bernard Shaw observed that, quote, when the angel of death sounds his trumpet, the pretenses of civilization are blown from men's heads into the mud like hats in a gust of wind. I love that. Sadly, laboratory studies show how just a slight turn of the existential screw is sufficient to tilt people in this direction. Death fears inflame violence toward others with different beliefs, especially those whom we designate as evil. To demonstrate this propensity, we put together an experiment based on a hot sauce attack that occurred in 1995. In February of that year, a breakfast cook at a Denny's restaurant in Lebanon, New Hampshire, decided to play a little joke on a couple of Vermont state troopers who'd crossed over into the state for breakfast. He didn't like police much, so he decided to douse their food with a generous helping of Tabasco sauce. It's a very hot sauce. The troopers weren't happy. They said the eggs burned their mouths and upset one of the officers' stomach. We've got enough trouble without people screwing around with our food, said Lebanon Police Lieutenant Ken Larry. Weeks later, the cook was arrested for assault and faced a punishment of up to 2 years in jail and a $2,000 fine. This is not an isolated incident. Teens have been known to pour hot sauce down each other's throats in fights, and parents have been charged with child abuse for making their children drink hot sauce as punishment. Inspired by such episodes, we brought politically conservative and liberal students into the lab for a study of personality and food preferences. We had them either think about death by answering their standard questions or think about their next important exam. They also wrote a bit about their background, interests, and dietary preferences, purportedly to exchange with the student in the next cubicle with whom they would be working during the food preference portion of the experiment. Participants received materials from their partners that were either consistent or inconsistent with their liberal or conservative identities. The materials were concocted. There was no actual partner. Their partner's statement contained sentences such as, the best place for a liberal or alternative conservative is out of my sight. And liberals or conservatives are the cause of so many problems in this country, it's not funny. They also learned that their partner strongly disliked spicy foods. When they asked them to pour some painfully hot salsa into a cup and said, your partner in the next room has to consume the sauce entirely before rating its culinary qualities. How much hot sauce would they allot to their partners, knowing they dislike spicy foods and that they would have to consume all of it? We found that the students who wrote about their next exam didn't care one way or the other about their partner's political beliefs, liberal or conservative. They doled out a modest amount of the hot sauce for their partner to consume. Students who wrote about their own mortality were similarly restrained when their partners shared their political views. But students who disagreed with the views of their partner poured out more than twice as much hot sauce, often filling the cup to the brim after they thought about death. This was the first direct evidence that the fear of death magnifies the desire to physically harm those who challenge and insult our beliefs. But it was not the last. In a 2006 experiment, American conservatives, reminded of their mortality or events in 9/11, were more supportive of a preemptive nuclear and chemical attacks on countries that pose no immediate threats to the United States. They also felt that capturing or killing Osama bin Laden was worth such a risk, even if thousands of innocent civilians were killed or injured in the process. Another study found that death reminders made Americans more accepting of U.S. intelligence using brutal and humiliating interrogation techniques, torture, on foreign suspects. Parallel studies in Israel found that reminders of mortality led political conservative Israelis to view violence against the Palestinians as more justified. These participants were also more supportive of a preemptive nuclear attack on Iran. And after pondering their mortality, Iranian college students increased their support for martyrdom attacks on the United States. They were also more interested in becoming suicide bombers themselves. Finally, in a particularly ominous study, Jeff Schmiel and his colleagues at the University of Alberta asked devoutly Christian participants to read either a non-threatening article about the Aurora Borealis or an article entitled "Islam Poised to Swallow Jesus' Boyhood Home," concocted from actual news reports and designed to be threatening to Christians. The article said, tens of thousands of residents looked on while leaders of the Islamic movement, the main Muslim political party in Nazareth, paraded down the main thoroughfare. While the march was billed as a celebration, its militant virtues were clearly visible. The event seemed more to show off force than a street party. Dressed in battle gear, Muslim celebrants beat drums and brandished their party's green flag as a man on a loudspeaker repeatedly exclaimed in Arabic, "Allah is great," and hundreds of activists strutted screaming Islamic epithets, including "Islam is the only truth" and "Islam shall rule all." Half of the participants also read an additional paragraph describing a plane crash. In related news, 170 devout Muslims passed away today en route to the Feast of the Sacrifice in Nazareth. There were no reported survivors. Then everyone in the study was given a word stem completion task to measure how readily death thoughts came to mind. Not surprisingly, the Christians who just read "Islam Poised to Swallow Jesus' Boyhood Home" had much higher levels of death thoughts than those who read about the Aurora Borealis, showing that the idea of Muslims occupying sacred Christian territory raised the specter of death. And here is the scary part. Those who also read that Muslims had died in a plane crash had the same low level of death thoughts as those who read about the Aurora Borealis. The death of evildoers reduced their own mortal terror. Nothing new under the sun. We have now seen how man's inhumanity to man stems from humankind's fundamental intolerance of and propensity to humiliate those who subscribe to different cultural worldviews. This is compounded by the need to dispose of residual death anxiety by projecting it onto evil others. Surely disagreements over territory and access to scarce resources also play a central role in human discord. But such pragmatic considerations also reflect deeper symbolic concerns. What one group claims as its God-given right is viewed by others as a humiliating injustice. What one group views as righteous reaction to humiliating justice, the other views as an act of greed and aggression. As both sides claim the ethical high ground and bemoan the indignities to which they have been subjected, violent confrontations seem not only justified, but morally imperative. The strange beliefs, values, customs, and even physical appearance of the others seem to affirm their wrong-mindedness and malevolent intent. Material disputes quickly escalate into cosmic battles of good us versus evil them. Rather than battling over trade routes or water rights, the individuals who do the actual killing and dying fight for the glory of Rome, to chase the infidels from the Holy Land, to rid the world of Jewish vermin, or to stop the malignant spread of communism, capitalism, or Islam. Ironically, then, a good deal of evil in the world results from the efforts to rid the world of evil. As Ernest Becker starkly put it, the natural and inevitable urge to deny mortality and achieve a heroic self-image are the root of causes of human evil. 2,500 years ago, the Greek historian Thucydides came to strikingly similar conclusions. He had closely studied the events of the Peloponnesian War in the quest to see the truth of what both has happened and will hereafter happen again according to human nature. He noted that above and beyond protecting themselves and their property, people fought most vigorously in defense of their ideological principles, and that those willing to die in zealous devotion to a cause were driven by an overriding passage for revenge that often resulted in escalating savagery and cruelty. Because people prepared to fight and die for their beliefs are absolutely certain they are right, any threat to act of violence directed against them must be avenged. Indeed, according to Thucydides, that's a hard one, to avenge oneself against someone was valued more than never to have suffered injustice oneself. But if revenge is sweeter than never having been wrong in the first place, then clearly people fight for reasons beyond land rights, self-protection, or a genuine concern for justice. What reasons? Thucydides contends that through warfare, people strive to overcome their mortal condition, writes political scientist Peter Arnsdorf, by living on after their death, either through their city or through their glory or in an afterlife, and by winning the God's favor through the vehement affirmation of their own nobility or piety or justice. People thus fight and are willing or even eager to die for a cause, to garner honor from their compatriots and curry favor with the gods in pursuit of symbolic and literal immortality. Reminders of mortality, so common once sparks fly, will intensify fighting for everlasting glory, and the quest for immortality will go on and on because it can never be indisputably secured. Out on a limb, life, wrote biologist Stephen Jay Gould, is a copiously branching bush, continually pruned by the grim reaper of extinction, not a ladder of predictable progress. That is a good one. While other creatures have succumbed to abrupt climate changes or competition from other plants or animals, we humans are the only species that can prune our own branch from the proverbial tree of life. Although symbolization, self-consciousness, and the capacity to transform figments of our imagination into reality have been of tremendous service to us humans, they have also made us aware of our vulnerability, transience, and mortality. Confidence in a cultural scheme of things and our own self-worth banish the dread. But when someone different challenges our core beliefs or sense of significance, we want to derogate, dehumanize, assimilate, demonize, humiliate, and destroy them. Perhaps the only reason humans have survived to date is that until recently, we lacked the technological means to exterminate ourselves. The 21st century combination of lethal weapons that can wreak unfathomable havoc and kill huge numbers of people with video game-like remote control devices makes killing easier on the conscious than face-to-face lethal encounters. And because nation states will use whatever military technology they possess to defend their secular or religious ideologies, whether to keep the world safe for democracy or to rid the world of evil, there's a very real danger that we humans will be the first form of life to be responsible for our own extinction. However, we humans have a pretty good track record of solving seemingly intractable problems once we understand their underlying basis. Infectious diseases exterminated millions of people until we figured out that illness was caused by germs, not by evil spirits. This led to a discovery of antibiotics and the practice of modern medicine. Perhaps once we fully recognize the central role that mortar terror plays in persistent strife, human ingenuity can also find ways of counteracting the destructive potential of fear, potential our fears can and do unleash. And then next week, this is another great chapter, Body and Soul, an Uneasy Alliance. We'll talk about the being an animal. That chapter 7 is so profound to me. It lays out the whole scheme of things, if you will, not easier, but it lays out the whole idea behind why we treat people who are different from us in such terrible ways. And to the extent that the psychological underpinnings of what's happening, and we don't even know it. Like it says, we think we're going under a flag or under a religious symbol and we're doing great things and we're ridding the world of evil, using evil, this feedback loop continuously going on. Let's see. Meaningful, well, there's somebody. Okay. Hey, Thilo, good to see you. Good to see you. Meaningful suffering. Is Ernest Becker an antinatalist? Ooh, that's a great question there. I do not believe Becker is an antinatalist. And for those that don't know what an antinatalist is someone that believes not only humans, but all animals, any living creature should not reproduce, should stop reproducing, not do anything drastic, but just, well, I guess that's drastic, but just stop reproducing. That's an antinatalist. Peter Wessel-Zapfe is definitely an antinatalist. Same with Thomas Ligotti is an antinatalist, and some would say a nihilist as well. Second question, he says, is there a similarity between Peter Wessel-Zapfe and Ernest Becker? Yes, very much so. I'm going to read The Last Messiah at some point, and we'll discuss that. And yes, I believe Peter Zapfe wrote The Last Messiah in 1933. I can't imagine, although I haven't found anything yet, I can't imagine Ernest Becker was not influenced by that, because Zapfe lays out clearly 4 strategies for denying death. Symbolic immortality, literal immortality. He lays out these isolation, anchoring, distraction, and sublimation. Sublimation is one that I think he says that's the least used, but that's using art to project your anxiety of death onto. But yeah, those are great questions. Thanks for joining us. Meaningful suffering till 2070. Okay, yeah, I like it. those are good questions. I appreciate them. But yes, I think they're both. I lean on Becker a lot because, and I know people are going to disagree with me here. He's not as pessimistic as people like Zapfe, or if you read Thomas Ligotti's book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. This will keep you up at night. This is where I learned about Zapfe, and he's definitely he's a horror writer. Thomas Ligotti. I've never read him before, but he's a horror writer. And at the end of the day, I think if you look at it as a whole and you take in, so this isn't a panacea for all human behavior. And I want to make that clear, because I think at times we get these ideas that we've latched onto something and we hold it real tight, kind of like a cultural worldview. But I want to be clear that I know this isn't a panacea, that all human behavior acts under this banner, but I will say, I think most of our behavior, specifically the behavior that I'm outlining or they're outlining and we're talking about in this book, And what my project is dealing with, the Tabawatch Ute Indians that lived here every summer, that lived on this land where I'm sitting right now, and what happened to them. Just one example of this, right? Just one example of European colonizers coming in, having their blinders on, acting unconsciously, but the psychological underpinnings were definitely there. Death anxiety, death denial, and terror management. We're talking about how human beings manage that anxiety, that terror, how we deal with unconsciously knowing that we're going to die and what we do. Most Americans now are just literally shopping and drugging and drinking and doom scrolling on social media. That's how most human beings deal with it now in America. But there are other ways people deal with it. And so when you're in a powerful position, whether it's individuals or countries or groups, and you have the other that you need to deal with, and you can't assimilate or accommodate them, you kill them, you get rid of them. And that's how, if you look at all the major wars, you're going to find this phenomenon there. You're going to find leaders like Hitler, Idi Amin, Genghis Khan, all those, Attila the Hun, all those people we mentioned are all working under this banner, this psychological banner of death anxiety and terror management theory. That's why it's fascinating to me. My work, my photographic, my artwork, my creative work isn't just about making random photographs of pretty things, right? I mean, there's an aesthetic quality to it, of course, all that kind of thing. But I want it underpinned by these ideas. This story that's holding these images up are about human behavior. And just like in the book, they said when they ran across Becker, it's like a Rosetta Stone moment. That same for me. I mean, I've been wrestling with these questions for over 30 years. I've been wondering why I had these questions about marginalized societies, why human beings treat one another so differently. Once you start recognizing, Jeffrey sent me an email talking about a band. Once you start recognizing these things in life, this in-group, out-group, death anxiety, terror management, once you understand these theories, you're going to start seeing it everywhere. Oh my God, I look at that. Look at that lyric, Methuselah, right? Immortality. You're going to start connecting the dots. And for me, what's so powerful for me is that I've been wrestling and struggling with these questions for so long that this was just such an empowering moment. I have to do this. I have to share these ideas. And I love it. In the last paragraph we just read there in chapter 7, the authors say, look, humans have this great track record of overcoming these really big problems, right? Like bacteria infections and not hanging it on, ghosts and demons and stuff like that. And we come up with penicillin. We come up with ways to, we have these incredible ways of dealing with things. So it's encouraging to read that last little bit there, because at the end of the day, if we make people, human beings, aware of their unconscious psychological activity and how they're acting and why they think the way they think, there may be a tiny little bit. I don't plan on changing the world myself. I plan on, I observe and I see, and I want to throw a pebble in your shoe. And for the 2 people that are listening or watching this, I hope it's doing something, because that's how I was turned on to it, right? That's how I understand my prejudice. I understand why I've had feelings for things, whether it's under a flag or under a whatever symbol that I'm standing under, and I have that cultural worldview built into me. We have an opportunity to change that, is what I'm saying. One of the quotes that I use in my book, I paraphrase it loosely here, is from Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist. And he said, paraphrasing, he said, when you make the unconscious conscious, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be fake. That's what I'm trying to do. I want to encourage people to make the unconscious conscious. This is really, people say, Well, I'm just not interested in this. What do you mean? I don't think about death. I don't, that's not on my mind. Of course not. Of course it isn't. You're ensconced, you're wrapped in a bubble of cultural worldview. That's the whole point of it. That's why you don't think about it. Because you're in the system, right? Red pill or blue pill, right? You're in the system. So the system says, evolutionarily speaking, we've developed ways, culture primarily, to wrap yourself, to make things up that seem really important. And that exam I've got to take is the biggest thing in the world. That job promotion I got to get is the biggest thing in the world. That photograph that I have to make today is the most important thing in the world, right? Whatever it is. We've talked many times about how many different ways there are to buffer your anxiety. That's why you don't think about this stuff, is because the system works. If it didn't work, you'd be curled up in the corner in a ball. Like they said, reaching for a Xanax the size of a Buick. You wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning. You literally could not function if these evolutionary buffers did not work. So what I'm saying is, don't strip them away. It's okay if you have a religion, or if you have a favorite football team, or you have a great job, or a family, or whatever you rely on to buffer that. That's wonderful, as long as you're not hurting other people. I say go for it. That's wonderful. That's great. I'm not saying strip those away and live in this stark reality of nothingness or meaninglessness. What I'm saying is be conscious of how these things affect your thinking. Oh, I don't like that. I don't like that lifestyle. I don't believe that. I don't like that political group. I don't like the way they wear their hair. I don't like the size of their nose. I don't like whatever it is, right? I love that quote about blowing the hats into the mud, right? I love that whole idea when the pretenses go away. This whole idea of coming to terms, as Camus said, coming to terms with death. Therefore, after that, anything's possible. I really believe what he means by that is, if we all became conscious of the reality and dealt with it, right? Nobody's going to remember us. It doesn't matter how great your book is, Quinn, or how great your photographs are, or how many. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. But what it does for me is it buffers my anxiety, and it gives me something to cling to, finding meaning and significance in my life. And you need that. But I've come to terms that it doesn't matter. I've come to terms that I'm going to die, and the closer I get to I'm 60 years old next year, so the closer I come to that, I hope I have. But here I go, death denial. I hope I have a few years left. But as the closer I come to that reality, the more I want to engage these ideas of impermanence and ultimately insignificance. That's what we fear. We fear not being remembered, and we fear that we haven't done enough in life. We have and just stand out in the cosmos and look at the sky, realize how tiny you are, realize your finitude. That'll humble you a little bit, I think. So next week is great. Next week is chapter 8, body and soul in an easy alliance. It's rattling. It's going to rattle some people. It's difficult to get your head around this. One of the first things we do to deny our death is we deny that we're animals. We deny that we're something special, right? We're not a worm or a squirrel. We're not like that. We're not animals, right? And that's our cultural worldview mostly tells us that. So we're going to blow that out of the water. We're going to talk about, using restrooms, toilets, our nasty stuff that comes out of our body, sex. We're going to talk about all that stuff and how we repress those things helps us to deny death and repress the anxiety of death. So thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. In this, I guess, more of a lecture, right? I'm the one talking, but I appreciate your time. And I hope, like I said, we've talked a lot about the history and the buildup of this and the human evolution and all that. Now we're getting into the meat of the things. And again, this is where my project really takes hold. This is what inspired what I'm doing right now. Becker inspired it Solomon, Greenberg, and Pyszczynski put the icing on the cake for me and gave me that empirical evidence to work with. So I'm doing my best. Actually, I think I'm going to go out and make some photographs today. It's a beautiful day on the mountain. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of the weekend or day or week, whatever you're watching this. Stay healthy, stay happy, be grateful, try to be humble. I try to a little bit of humbleness. And I think your life will be, find your life goes a little easier, accept that finality. I love to discuss different views, especially when we don't agree with each other, but to cross the line where we want to get rid of others. Yeah, so, well, Linda, I think, see, that's where humility comes in, right? That's where, just like the book we just read, it talks about, look, I have my cultural worldview and somebody has a different worldview. And that's threatening to me because, and I don't think this out loud, it's unconscious, but that different worldview is threatening to me because mine may be wrong. And if it's wrong, it's the very thing I'm leaning on to repress this anxiety. So I lash out. So that's the idea. So that's where humility comes in. And you say, this is my position, just real quickly. I say, you can deal with your death anxiety in any way, whatever your cultural worldview is, whatever you cling on to, do it. Like I said, if it's a religion, a family, a sports team, a hobby, artwork, whatever it is, cling to it as long as it's not hurting other people, right? And that's the caveat to me. That's where I don't have a problem with religion in the sense of somebody being religious, but I have a problem with the historicity or the historical component of what's happened in religion, right? We just read some of it today, but both teams going at it, so to speak. But that's where humility comes in. Is if you can say, look, I may not agree with your worldview, but guess what? If that's the way you deal with your anxiety, I'm going to let you deal with it because I got to deal with my own anxiety, and I'm going to let you deal with your anxiety in your way. And that's where you can agree to disagree and not go to war, not lash out. You're going to have those feelings, right? You'll have those feelings. I'm not saying you have feelings because somebody doesn't like chocolate ice cream and you like chocolate ice cream. You're not going to hit them over the head with the baseball bat. But what I'm saying is you will have uneasy feelings. That's the terror. That's the rumble of the terror of you feeling a certain way. Just be cognizant, be aware of, ooh, I feel uneasy about that. When you see something, when you talk to somebody that's different, that's out of your cultural worldview, that's out of your silo, and you start doing this, know why it's happening and understand at the end of the day, it's okay. You don't have to agree necessarily, but surely you don't have to crusade against them. No pun intended, right? But yes, it is absolutely want to get rid of them because it is crazy. And it's all through history. We've seen it. So thank you so much. I'll stop talking. You guys have a great day. Jeffrey Boguslaw, thank you for joining me today. I really do appreciate that. You have the wonderful rest of your weekend, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Ciao. Bye-bye.